God allowed drinking. It is not a sin. However, don't miss this. Don't miss this. I need you to catch this. However, God allowed drinking on a condition. Thank you for watching another episode of Simplify. So glad that you could join us today. Want to also thank you for your support and hitting that subscribe and that like button. If you hadn't done so already, please hit that subscribe and that like button, as well as leave a comment in the comment section. Now today, what I'm going to talk about today is Deuteronomy chapter 14, verse 26. In my previous videos that I've made where I'm talking about why Christians should not be drinking wine and liquor, there were some people who disagreed, and that's fine. You can disagree. And some of the comments I saw the verse Deuteronomy 14:26 come up as a verse that shows that Christians can drink wine and liquor. I was also asked to explain it, but at that time I hadn't put a whole lot of study in Deuteronomy 14:26, but I have now, a couple of weeks actually, to prepare this lesson and to present it to you. So today what we're going to do is take a look at Deuteronomy chapter 14, verse 26, but we're going to read some of the verses before and after to get a full understanding of the context. But before we open up God's words to discuss God's words, let's have a word of prayer and ask God for his wisdom, guidance, and understanding. All right, Deuteronomy chapter 14. Now, we're going to begin reading a couple of verses here, but what we're going to do, we're going to start at verse 22. Now, if you have a study Bible, and as you scroll down or open up to Deuteronomy 14, you should see this subheading which says tithe. This lets us know that the verses beneath this subheading are related to tithe. Now, if you do a deeper study, you will also find that this tithe, this particular tithe, is connected to the Feast of Tabernacles, which happens towards the end of the Hebrew year. Now, this isn't a ordinance that deals with animal sacrifices. This is a part of the service that deals with tithes. There's some feasting involved with it, but it deals with tithe. And however, whatever is said to explain these verses that are beneath it, we need to keep in mind that this is related to tithe. So let's do some reading. We'll start at verse 22, and then we will move further into the lesson. Deuteronomy chapter 14, verse 22 says this: Thou shalt truly tithe all the increase of thy seed that the field bringeth forth year by year. Verse 23. And thou shalt eat before the Lord thy God in the place which he shall choose to place his name there, the tithe of thy corn, of thine wine, of thine oil, and the firstlings of thy herds and of thy flocks, that thou mayest learn to fear the Lord thy God. Verse 24, Lord thy God always. Verse 24, and if the way be too long for thee, so that thou art not able to carry it, or if the place be too far from thee, which the Lord thy God shall choose to set his name there, when the Lord thy God hath blessed thee, then, verse 25, shalt thou turn it into money, and bind up the money in thine hand, and shall go unto the place which the Lord thy God shall choose. Verse 26, and thou shalt bestow that money for whatsoever thy soul lusteth after, for oxen, or for sheep, or for wine, or for strong drink, or for whatsoever thy soul desireth, that thou shalt eat there before the Lord thy God, and thou shalt rejoice, thou and thine household. Verse 27. And the Levite that is within thy gates, thou shalt not forsake him, for he hath no part nor inheritance with thee. And at the end of 3 years thou shalt bring forth all the tithe of thine increase the same year, and shall lay up within and shall lay it up within thy gates. This is one of the key verses that if you were to study that, you will see that this 3 years, at the end of 3 years, this is linked to the Feast of Tabernacles. Verse 29. And the Levite, because he hath no part nor inheritance with thee, and the stranger, and the fatherless, and the widow, which are within thy gates, shall come and shall eat and be satisfied, that the Lord thy God may bless thee in all the work of thine hand, which thou doest. Now, one thing we should always keep in mind, again, you saw it in your study Bible, if you have your study Bible, that all of these verses that we just read, all of these verses are connected to tithe. It's an instruction or an ordinance regarding tithe. Now in Leviticus chapter 27, this is what it says. And all the tithe of the land, whether of the seed of the land or of the fruit of the tree, is the Lord's. It is holy unto the Lord. Now, all of this section is about tithe. All tithe is holy unto the Lord. So even in the verses where it said, purchase something whatsoever your soul lusteth after, it doesn't give you free reign to just go and buy any type of meat that you want to buy. Because in the previous verses in this same chapter, it tells you what meats are clean and what meats are unclean. So whatever you're doing regarding God's tithe, whether it's of crop or livestock, it has to all be within God's design, all be within God's will. Now, in verse 23, this is what it says. Deuteronomy 14:23, and thou shalt eat before the Lord thy God the tithe of thy wine. Now, this is showing us that this is from the concordance, a Hebrew word. The reference number is 8492. But what does that mean? Hebrews, in the Hebrew number 8492, this is what it means. It means Tarosh. Now, some of you may need to see it from the Strong's Concordance, and that's okay. We can do that. We'll take you to the Strong's Concordance. That word, that word Tarosh. See what it means. What does it mean? It's Tarosh. Comes from this word in the sense of expulsion, meaning like squeeze out, must, or fresh grape juice, or just squeezed out. By implication, rarely fermented wine. Now let's focus on this part right here real quick. It says, by implication, rarely fermented wine. So when we read Deuteronomy chapter 14, verse 23, and the Lord is telling them of the things that they shall eat. Now, he's telling them that thou shalt eat before the Lord, and he says, the tithe of thy corn and of thy oil and of thy wine. Is that implied? If it's not implied, then we cannot apply the implied definition to the word, which here shows us in the Strong's Concordance that it's rarely used, because the Lord is telling them the things that they shall eat. It is literal corn, literal oil, literal wine. And we use the word literal because then we go and look up wine, then we have to use the literal definition, not what's implied. What's implied is, by implication, rarely fermented wine. But God isn't implying that they bring wine. God is telling them that they are to bring wine. And what does it say that wine means? Again, H8492, must, or fresh grape juice as just squeezed out. Now, what I didn't do, and I wish I would have thought of this earlier when I was putting this slide together. We're going to go and look up what must is. Now, and we're talking about grapes. So let's look up grape must from the internet. Grape must is the freshly crushed juice from grapes that includes skin, seeds, and stems. Now they take that and they turn it into alcohol by allowing it to ferment, but grape must is freshly crushed grapes, the juice from freshly crushed grapes. Let's go to another source and see what is grape must. This is from the chefresource.com. Grape must is the juice from crushed grapes with skins, seeds, and stems. Macy's Wine Shop. We all know Macy's, the store Macy's. Grape must is freshly pressed grape juice that is fermented and turned into wine. So they take the freshly crushed grape juice and ferment it. It's freshly pressed grapes. So we know that when you take grapes and you press it freshly, that it doesn't start out fermented. It has to get fermented. But must is freshly pressed grape juice. Now let's go back to our slide here. So understanding that in verse 23, we're not implying, God isn't implying that we bring wine, because if he were implying, then then the rare definition of fermented wine would apply. But he isn't implying that they bring wine. He's telling them to bring wine. And in this case, according to Tyrosh, this Hebrew word that applies to wine here, it means must or fresh grape juice as just squeezed out. Talking about just squeezing it out, right? So when he says a tithe of thy wine, it can also read a tithe of grape juice. And I know a lot of people don't want to hear that. They don't want to hear it. They don't want to see it. I just showed you from the Strong's Concordance. I just showed you from several sources on the internet that must is freshly pressed grape juice. So when we read Deuteronomy chapter 14, verse 23, and thou shalt eat before the Lord thy God the tithe of thy grape juice, thy freshly pressed grape juice. So remembering and not forgetting that this entire section of Deuteronomy is talking about tithe. Now, why is that? Deuteronomy 14:23 says that thou mayest learn to fear the Lord thy God always. Now, again, don't miss this point, because a lot of people go to Deuteronomy 14:26 and they use that to justify that Christians can drink wine and liquor today, and that will be any day they choose. But this entire section is about tithe. Verse 22 says, and thou shalt truly tithe all the increase of thy seed that the field bringeth forth year by year. And when is that? That's year by year or annually, talking about an annual harvest. Now, what is that annual harvest? That annual harvest is of corn. Again, this whole tithe process, because they talked about at the end of 3 years, this whole tithe process, when you do a deeper study, is connected to the Feast of Tabernacles. No, it does not have to do with animal sacrifices. This is just a portion related to the order of tithes. So this annual harvest is of corn, of grape juice or wine, oil or tarosh, oil, and the firstling of thy herd and of thy flocks. Now, this year-end tithe, this year-end harvest of these corn, grape juice, oil, and the firstlings of herd and flock, it was a harvest worth. Now, verse 23, and thou shalt eat before the Lord thy God in the place which he shall choose to place his name there. Now, you talking about bringing a harvest worth of crops, a harvest worth of corn, a harvest worth of oil, and the firstling of your herd and your flock. Understand that fermented wine and liquor was allowed by God, but only on a condition. What was that condition? The Bible tells us, it said, if the place that God chose is too far or too long a way off, right? If is the condition. If wherever God put his name and told you to go to have this feast, to bring your tithe, if it was too far or a long way off, then the condition would apply. Now think about this. They have this year-end harvest. They got baskets of corn. They got a bunch of wine skins full of grape juice or wine, tarosh. bottles of oil. They got the firstlings of the herd, the firstlings of the flock. And this place they got to go is so far away. Wherever this place is, it's so far away. God gives them an instruction where they can then sell that they have and get the money for it. Now think about this. The money that they get, that's tithe money. They took the tithe of the corn, the tithe of the oil, the tithe of the grape juice, the tithe of the firstling of the herd and of the flock, and converted it into money. Now that money is tithe. Remember what the verse said. The tithe is holy unto the Lord. They they're giving freedom on how to spend it, but they don't have total freedom because it's holy unto the Lord. So whatever they are desiring still has to be within the parameters of what God allows. So they sell that information, and then guess what? They take the money, that tithe money, to the place that God has chosen. We read that in verse 25. Now, when they get to the place where God has chosen, they're allowed to buy oxen or sheep or wine or strong drink or whatsoever their soul desireth or lusteth after. Let's put this in the imagery form. So they've got all of this crop, all of this herd, all of these barrels of oil, barrels of wine, even, and the place is too long. Let's say the place is 120 miles away. That would be roughly about a 2 mile journey. If that place is too far away where they're to go and have this feast, then they're allowed to convert it into money because it is easier to carry bags of money. It's easier to carry bags of money to this place far away instead of having to manage and drag all of this crop and all of this oil and wine to that distance. So when they get to where they're going, God then gives them provisions and permission to buy the feast food at the place where he puts his name. Now, let's look at something here because in my study, this is what I noticed. If we compare verse 23 to verse 26, look at what it says. Verse 23, and thou shalt eat before the Lord thy God in the place which he shall choose to place his name there, the tithe of thy corn, of thy wine, and of thine oil, and the firstling of thy herd, and of thy flocks, that thou mayest learn to fear the Lord thy God. Now compare that to verse 26. This is what they're allowed to do once they reach that place that's far away after they've converted the crops and the livestock to money. Once they get to the place where God has put his name, they're allowed to buy. But look at this. Verse 26, and thou shalt bestow that money for whatsoever thy soul lusteth after. And again, all of this again has to be in parameters of what God allows, especially when it comes to the meats, because in the earlier part of this chapter, chapter 14, he tells them what the clean and unclean meats are, right? It says, thou shalt bestow the money for whatsoever thy soul lusteth after, for oxen, or for sheep, or for wine, or for strong drink, or for whatsoever thy soul desireth, that thou shalt eat there before the Lord thy God, and thou shalt rejoice, thou and thine household. So what do you notice here? Well, when it comes to verse 23, it says, and, meaning they have to bring the corn and the wine and the oil and the firstling of the herds and the firstling of the flock. Verse 26 is optional. They bring the oxen or the sheep or the wine or the strong drink or whatsoever thy soul desires. So at this place that God chose, and they have this tithe money there, we see that when it comes to verse 26, they got options to buy these things or whatsoever their soul desireth. So when they get here to this place in verse 26 with this tithe money, it says they could buy wine or strong drink. Now, this wine here is a different reference number than it is in verse 23. This wine here, this again, this wine here in verse 26 is yayin, which means effervescence, which means wine that is fermented. And by implication, intoxication. But we're not talking about intoxication because we're talking about the wine. We're talking about the liquid, the wine that is fermented. They can get to this place with this tithe money and they can buy wine. Why? Because back then, the fresh grape juice fermented pretty quickly. So if the place is too far away, then God is relieving them of the burden of having to carry all of that, right? Now, it would be nice to say that by the time they get to the place that it's not fermented, because if God can keep the shoes on their feet from not going bad, and they wandered around, and Israel wandered around the wilderness for 40 years, if he can keep the shoes on their feet from not going bad, I know God can keep the fresh grape juice fresh until they get there. The thing was, the burden was carrying all of this stuff. So he allowed them to get to the place where they would reach and buy whatever was there that was available. And if whatever is there that's available ain't fresh, then God allowed them to buy the wine that was there, even if it is fermented already. Now, it also says that they were allowed to buy wine or strong drink. Strong drink is clearly liquor, according to the shakar, the Hebrew word for that, which is it's an intoxicant that is intensely alcoholic liquor. Now, it is this verse 26, Deuteronomy 14:26, that many Christians today in my comment section will come and bring to me as proof that Christians can drink wine or liquor. But I want us to see something here. At the place that God chose in verse 23, they don't have tithe money. They just have the tithe of the tithe of the corn, the tithe of the oil, the tithe of the wine, the firstling of the flock or the herd. Remember, it didn't have an option there. They had to bring that, the wine and the oil and the corn and the herd, firstling of the herd, and the firstling of the flock. Now the thing is that wine, again, remember, in verse 23, the first definition, the most popular part of the definition is must or fresh grape juice as just squeezed out. Again, God is never implying that they bring wine. It's not he's never it's not an implication. He's not implying that they bring wine. They have to actually bring wine. That makes it literal, so we use the literal definition. I hope that makes sense, because we learn how to use dictionaries and encyclopedias in grade school. So we know how to look up words. We know how to choose the definition that fits the context of what we're reading. But notice in verse 23, it does not mention strong drink. Let's take a look at that. It does not mention strong drink in verse 23. So when we look at verse 23, and he says, and thou shalt eat before the Lord thy God in the place which he shall choose to place his name there, the tithe of thy corn, thy wine, and of thy oil, and the firstling of the herd and of the flock. Where is strong drink? It's not there, which shows us that not only is the word wine here, and we see that it means, again, and I'll pull it up on the screen for if anyone is just tuning in, that word wine in this verse, did I click on it? The word wine in this verse means expulsion, as in just squeezed out, must, or fresh grape juice as just squeezed out. And we just looked up again what the word must mean. We notice again that strong drink is not mentioned. So think about that, right? Think about that. The wine is not implied. So the wine definition of wine here for this word tarosh means must or fresh grape juice as just squeezed out. There's no alcohol at this place. Now, I want to say this because we're reading this in scripture, and I don't want anyone to try to come at me crazy in the comments. So I'm going to say this. God allowed drinking, so it is not a sin. Some people say, show me where drinking is a sin. God allowed drinking. It is not a sin. However, don't miss this. Don't miss this. I need you to catch this. However, God allowed drinking on a condition. There was a condition that allowed drinking. See, a lot of people come in my comments and they pull up Deuteronomy 14:26 as if they just dropped the mic on me. But they miss the fact that in order to even claim Deuteronomy 14:26, a condition had to be met. What is that condition? That condition is found in verse 24. And if the way be too long for thee, so that thou art not able to carry it, and if the place be too far from thee, if the way is too long, so that it's a burden for you to carry all of this stuff, or if the place is too far away from thee, then you could sell the crop and the livestock, take the money and carry the bags of money to the place, and then once you get there, make the purchases, right? Or let's be specific and keeping it on topic of this video, buy the alcoholic wine and liquor. Now, if the place is not too far from thee, if the place is not too far away, not too long way off, then you must abide by verse 23. And thou shalt eat before the Lord thy God in the place which he shall choose to place his name there, the tithe of thine corn, of thy grape juice, thy wine, thy tarosh, and of the oil, and the firstling of the herd, and of thy flock, that thou mayest learn to fear the Lord thy God always. Now, when it comes to Deuteronomy 14:26, as it applies today in 2025, the condition that is laid out that allowed the Israel to use Deuteronomy 14:26 to buy alcoholic wine and liquor, that condition does not apply to us today. Why is that? Well, on average, there's no church too far or too long way off from you. It is reported in many major cities, there are an average of 10 to 20 churches within a 5-mile radius. Not only that, in rural areas, you may find 5 to 10 churches within a 5-mile radius. So the condition was from God to the Hebrews is if the place be a long way off or if it's too far away, then the condition applies. But today, especially if you live in the city, there's a church right around the corner, 5 churches right around the corner. So that wouldn't apply. Plus, in today's time, no one returns tithes in crops and livestock. So you don't have to worry about taking crops and livestock to a place far away. So God says, okay, change it for money. And then when you, the condition don't apply. So there's no need to trade it in to buy wine and liquor. Again, when we understand Deuteronomy 14:26, it is talking about the tithe, right? But again, yes, at a point in time, God allowed and laid out the instructions that they should take that money and buy whatsoever their soul lusteth after. But remember, it was only on the condition that if the place is too far or too long way off. That's not the condition anymore. Therefore, today's Christians in 2025 and going forward should not be using Deuteronomy 14:26 to justify drinking alcoholic wine and liquor.